Hi everyone, thanks for being here. The play you just saw is a combination of my writing with the writing of Guyanese author Wilson Harris. It's kind of a work of fan fiction, and I combined our words to kind of find a theatrical direction inside of his metaphors and inside of the syntax of his sentences. As fans tend to do, I also have a portion analyzing his work and analyzing Wilson Harris in his own context, as well as his kind of contemporary relevance, or at least relevance to me. Um, so yeah, without further ado, let's get into the slideshow. Thanks again for being here. Thanks to the Studio Museum and in Harlem, as well as all of the funders for making this possible. Thanks very much to Anissa Jackson and Roxana Santana, the actors, wonderful actors in my play. Thank you to Cheyenne Marcano and everyone else on staff at the Studio Museum that's been pivotal to make this event happen. Okay. So Wilson Harris is a Guyanese writer. He was born in 1921 in New Amsterdam, a city in Guyana, and died in 2018 in Chelmsford, England. He attended Queen's College, began work as a government land surveyor in 1942, and rose to senior surveyor in 1955. Later we'll discuss the impact that this had on his work, which is massive. He saw how nature operated in a quantum way, that is to say, in a human way, as a living text. He wrote 3 poetry books before starting to write novels, of which he wrote 22. He also wrote 5 books of critical writing, 3 short story books, and he's got a couple of other small chapbooks, for example, one from the University of Austin, Texas, called Fossil and Psyche. He was married twice, first with Cecily Carew, the older sister of notable Guyanese novelist Jan Carew, and he's an expatriate since 1959, residing in England. He met his second wife there, Margaret Burns, a white Scottish poet. In his formative phase from 1945 to 1961, Harris was a regular contributor to the Guyanese magazine Kikoveral and hung out with other contributors like Martin Carter, Guyana's greatest poet, and Ivan Van Sertima, who's known for his pre-Columbian African and Afro-indigenous contact theories, as well as the editor A.J. Seymour. Here's a photo of Wilson. I had some photos at the beginning as well, different points of age in his life. And I use this poem as a kind of epigraph for the talk. I feel like it sums up Harris's practice very well. He says in the poem Amazon, in his poetry book Eternity to Season, "The world-creating jungle travels eternity to season. Not an individual artifice, this living movement, this tide, this paradoxical stream and stillness rousing reflection. This living jungle is too full of voices not to be aware of collectivity, and too swift with unseen wings to capture certainty." So here's a kind of overview of the talk's content. We're going to talk about nature and its quantum nature. We're going to talk about post-colonial rejection of realism, the abstraction of the cross-cultural, which involves nature as unconscious and mind as voyage, critical perspectives or tides on Harris throughout the years, Harris as a predecessor to different Caribbean movements of thought and action, and then some potential critiques along with his bibliography. So why Wilson Harris? I love the way he writes. It's psychedelic and searingly poetic. It's just one of the most beautiful things I've ever read, even when I don't fully understand it. As well, he and his peers were at the forefront of some important post-colonial Antillean conversations. And he's an interesting figure if we're thinking about the problematics of what Paget Henry calls the mythopoetic approach. We'll talk about this later, but Paget Henry has 2 general strands of thought and art in Caribbean practice. He calls it the historicist strain and the mythopoetic strain. And in part of his work, he tries to find common ground between the two and connect some of the gaps, so to speak. Also, Wilson Harris is relatively obscure, so that's kind of interesting to me. It's confusing that he's so well known in the Anglophone Caribbean, but then outside of that context, he's not very well known. Which is the case with a lot of these post-colonial authors. So much of their work was ahead of its time and was neglected because of it. And I myself neglected Harris. I knew about him in high school because I was a fan of T.S. Eliot in high school, unfortunately, and I knew about some of the authors that he had brought to Faber and Faber when he was the director in the 60s, Wilson Harris being one of them, but I just never got around to reading him until far too late in my life. I think it was about 6 years ago that I first read The Dark Jester from 2001, and then Palace of the Peacock, Harris's first novel. And unfortunately, I had a lot of time in my life where I wasn't exposed to his work, so I have catching up to do. And this talk is kind of an homage and a way of apologizing to Harris for neglecting him for so long. Okay, Guyana is an Anglophone Caribbean country on the South American mainland with a population of 784,000 people, according to the 2016 census. It was colonized first by the Dutch and then the British, and they achieved independence on the 26th of May 1966 and became a republic in 1970. Indigenous tribes in Guyana presently include the Waiwai, the Makuhi, the Patamona, Lokono, Kalinya, Wapishana, Pemon, Akawayo, and Warao. And the mixed population includes Amerindian, African, European, Indian, and East Asian aspects. Here's a map. Guyana is on the bottom right on the South American mainland. It's one of the countries on the South American mainland that is considered Caribbean. Not every Caribbean country is an island. Okay. How does Harris treat or understand nature? He says, I am intent on repudiating a dumbness or passivity with which we subconsciously or unconsciously robe the living world. The rainforest made an enormous impact on me. I learned that one should not attempt to, indeed one cannot colonize the unconscious. There's a link between being and what one calls non-being, and it may be possible that one's prayers for God could be answered through inhumans who appear to be mute, and whose gestures bring an answer to that prayer. In fact, their mute bodies must be read in concert with all sorts of engravings upon rocks, other surfaces. And the final quote. Just a heads up, there are a lot of quotes in this talk. When I come upon a felled tree in a park in England, it sometimes shapes itself in my inner eye as the epitaph of a murdered forest in Brazil, or Guyana, or Venezuela. So here we start to see some of the aspects of Harris's understanding of nature. Nature itself represents the unconscious, and it has a living energy. It's an ancestral energy that is embedded into the actual materials of nature, and we have to respect that, and we have to use that to our advantage, right? Because there's ways in which the ancestrally embedded content in the natural objects act in a spiritual way, act in a protective way. They can also, of course, be dangerous. And they work across time, right? So across time and place. This tree that falls in England is the epitaph of a tree very far away, but they're still connected. They're entangled in a quantum way. Here's a beautiful photo of the Guyanese interior. Harris spent, again, 20 years surveying the interior of Guyana. He says in an autobiographical essay that Joyce Adler wrote, or quotes, there was a large black trunk in my mother's bedroom which she opened for the first time in my presence on the day the news came that my stepdad had disappeared, presumed drowned, in the rivers and rainforests of Guyana. The year was 1929. I was 8 years old. My stepfather's death or disappearance was the second crucial bereavement my mother suffered in 6 years. My father had died suddenly in 1923. My memories of him were therefore quite naturally void or hollow, though on seeing the contents of the large open trunk he seemed strangely alive in my aroused imagination because of books of his my mother held up, a photograph to which she pointed in which he stood between two companions, and a horse carven from a greenheart tree. A subconscious thread or connection was woven then with the South American heartland of the Guyanas, into which I was to lead many survey expeditions as a young man. The impact of the forests and savannas on these expeditions was to become of profound value in the language of the fictions I later wrote. My stepfather's disappearance in that immense interior when I was a child was the beginning of an involvement with the enigma of quests and journeys through visible into invisible worlds that become themselves slowly visible to require further penetration into other visible worlds without end or finality. So I love this quote because it's one of the most straightforward pieces of writing that Harris presents. It's about his life, but it also takes on the same mystical qualities that I'm talking about, the same quantum qualities, and that his stepdad starts to stand in for this entire journey that he's taking. But his stepdad is also archetypal, right? He's not fully known in the sense that, well, whatever. We just read the quote. We understand what it says. Move on. Here's another photo of the Guyanese interior. So Harris was one of the early post-colonial authors that rejected realist writing. He argued that we need a new mythopoetic vision grounded not in linear dead time, but in sacred dream time, which is circular, fractal, and deep. Again, ancestrally embedded and embedded so much farther in the past than humans. He says, I was an unfashionable writer from the future. I belonged, yet did not belong. I was realitist of reality rather than realist of realism. This is from a draft of one of his novels that this actually got cut, but it's still relevant. There's no ground or alternatives but to recover the dangerous chasm, the forbidden ascent, and seek a new dimension of feeling, a new oath of humanity. So he called his style quantum fiction, as we've said. He said, my writing is quantum writing. Do you know of the quantum bullet? When it's fired, it leaves not one hole but two. The radical openness of language is the medium for quantum flux. Harris says, in describing the world you see, the language evolves and begins to encompass realities that are not visible. So nature itself is this portal. It has ancestrally embedded material, but it also, that material gives it a portal quality, right? And this goes back to the loop that Harris describes, from visible into invisible and continuing to reveal deeper and deeper layers of dialectics between the visible and the invisible. So for Harris, the philosophy of history may well lie buried in the arts of the imagination. This philosophy is not autonomous or abstract, but in line with Paget Henry's conception of Caribbean philosophy, is enmeshed and intertextually embedded in Caribbean forms of life. So Caribbean art is distinct from Western art because the art itself is not an autonomous object. It's embedded into the ways that people live in a vernacular context. And it's not thought of in the same way. Here's a cover of one of Wilson's books. He says, I believe that the images of a character and action are always refracted in the minds of people. A certain refraction or distortion occurs, and this signifies for me that the artist or the writer does not really possess this subjective purity that one imagines she possesses. It seems to me that her vision is fashioned by all sorts of things, small things that happen to her, perhaps the kind of food she eats, the kind of landscape which she remembers, and the kind of landscape in which she lives. I mean things that have to do with her emotional life, all sorts of circumstances, curious prejudices. I mean various things. We have to go very deep back into the ancestral past, and therefore there is, it seems to me, a certain impurity in the artist's vision, and therefore I have striven all the time to make character, landscape, and myth agents of each other. Possibly involuntary agents of each other, because I don't believe in the self-sufficiency of the artist. I don't believe in self-sufficient models. I think the self-sufficient model is an illusion, and I know that the fashionable novel does incline toward this self-sufficiency, because it is easy to read something where one finds oneself quickly in a facile way. But it seems to me that life is not like this, that this refraction occurs, this distortion occurs, and one has to somehow find a way of doing this in a novel. I think that while it has one disadvantage in that it makes for difficulty, it has an enormous advantage in that it encourages what I would call the open mind, where one knows that what is happening is not dogmatic, is not final, is not total. One knows that new possibilities can emerge, new things can happen. And sorry for the syntax in this quote. It is a direct transcription of a conversation, so it's not grammatical, but it's accurate. Here's another photo of Guyana. So let's talk a little bit more about the relationship between nature and quantum fiction. Here's a good quote. Harris says, the table comes from a tree in the forest. The forest is the lungs of the globe, and the lungs of the globe breathe on the stars. There are all sorts of connections, and those are quantum connections. Quantum mechanics and physics would embrace those connections. At that stage, he's describing his earlier period of writing, I had read nothing of quantum mechanics, and I simply addressed my repudiation of absolute chains upon nature. my repudiation of a nature there to serve me, to prop up my structures, as an intuitive, disturbing necessity. I needed to immerse myself in the living, disturbing, but immensely rich text of landscapes, riverscapes, skyscapes. Language began to break its contract with mere tools framed to enshrine a progressive deprivation. There was a more complex and intuitive approach to language, in which one suffers and through which one perceives the peculiar ecstasies of dimensionality. So nature itself, again, is this portal. It's a portal that when we face it, and we face the ancestrally embedded spiritual information in natural material, we're forced to actually change the way that we use language. Like, language itself breaks down, and something new has to be constructed to understand the dialectics of the visible and the invisible that are embedded into nature, and the different entanglements that Harris talks about. Here's a cliff in Guyana. Here's a painting by Stanley Greaves. He's got a series called Dialogues with Wilson Harris from 2014, and this one is called Artist and the Mother of Space. The abstraction of the cross-cultural. One of the things about Harris's work that's most interesting is his commitment to non-fixity of identity, his commitment to understanding things as always becoming rather than static. So his work emphasizes cross-cultural, syncretic, and creolized manifestations of survivance. By survivance, I'm using a term by Gerald Visionor to describe the continuing presence of ancestral legacies of creativity and resistance. So Harris, speaking on Haitian Vodun, says, for example, that the cross-cultural breaks the tribal monolith of the past and reassembles an intertribal or cross-cultural community of families, and to invoke at the same time a curious psychic reassembly of the parts of the dead god or gods, and that reassembly is issued from a state of cramp to articulate a new growth. So his prose is densely abstract, as we've seen a bit in the play as well as in these quotes. And it's steeped in the Caribbean imagination, in the language of fables, music, landscape, porch, church, etc. Some critics argue that Harris's work has more in common with South American magical realism, but I really disagree with this. I think it's deeply rooted in Caribbean aesthetics, and he also said that it was influenced by Caribbean aesthetics, so we can just take his word at face value. Why not? He's also distinct from the magical realists because he doesn't consign myth and fable to plot, right, as a kind of a deus ex machina or something, or as a kind of easy way to explain political content. You throw in something mystical and it stands in for struggle and oppression and stuff. Rather, Harris infuses his language with the values and ineffability of myth and fable. The instability of myth and fable are embedded into his actual sentences. Here's Harris in Guyana in the early 50s. In the middle, Harris is on the left, and in the middle is his boss, the head surveyor that Harris would eventually replace. And on the right is another worker. This guy is a shotgun there. So the voyage of the imagination. As we saw in the clip that we played before the play, Harris said, the voyage has immense value because the voyage has within it something that is divine. It's a searching, a quest for value. And the voyage and the quest has to be reclaimed from conquest, colonization, linearity of time, etc. Harris says, fiction possesses a revisionary capacity itself, as if the text possesses an intentionality of its own to uncover connections that lie in other and deeper layers of what appears to be lost, areas that can be recovered to assist us in reading reality in a new way that is also unfathomably alive to ancient perspectives and resources within the cross-cultural body or bodies of many civilizations whose past, whose traceries, whose elements and curious voices and so on and so forth we are susceptible to through and beyond our finite predicament. So this is a kind of Butlerian notion, like we are addressable by the world and the past. All of these unfinished and ongoing and syncretized surviving traditions, things that seem like they're lost, actually address us. Our bodies are the condition of addressability on the part of these lineages, we could call them, or these quantum entangled ancestral presences and continuities. Here's a nice piece that says migration is an act of courage. It's I forget who made it exactly, sorry, but it's a direct response to border violence. It's kind of a way of reimagining what it means to make a voyage, right? So Paget Henry argues that for Wilson Harris, consciousness is a universal living medium whose activities are necessary for the emergence and sustenance of all life forms. Harris says, when I speak of the unconscious, I am not only speaking of the human unconscious, but of the unconscious that resides in objects, in trees and in rivers. I am suggesting that there is a psyche, a mysterious entity that links us to the unconscious in nature. And the qualities or the nature of that psyche is such an interesting question, and it's something that Harris teases out a lot in his work. What is that thing that connects us? Who is it even, right? His focus on the unconscious of landscape and human works against the danger, his focus on the unconscious of landscape and human works against the danger of falling into the trap of intellectualizing issues which lie so much deeper. So that's one of my favorite things about Harris. He's committed to not intellectualizing stuff, and that's where his language comes from. That's why it's so steeped in magical thinking, right? He doesn't use reason in the same way that other people write. Here's another painting from the Stanley Greaves series, Dialogue with Wilson Harris. This one's called Abry Survey Pay Table. We can take Harris's Large of as a unified project, and he invites this. Characters from other novel universes make cameos, images and phrases rhyme and resonate across the novels, and the philosophy he expresses in his critical writing embodies itself best in his literary work. Similar gestures and narrative frames also abound, such as expeditions into the jungle interior of Guyana, walking around the streets of Scotland and England, unearthed journals of psychiatric patients, nonlinear narrative, massive leaps through space-time and across universes. For example, a protagonist in The Dark Jester jumping from a dream in a bed in England to medieval Peru to meet Pizarro and Atahualpa. Appearance as a character in his own books, that is to say, Wilson Harris is a character in Wilson Harris's own books sometimes. And archetypal protagonists like the Fool, the Dreamer, the Dark Jester, Idiot Nameless, etc. And Luisanora Chudesoke calls Harris's approach an ontological promiscuity. It's a very interesting description. What does it mean to be ontologically promiscuous, right? What does it mean to revel in the complexities of the universe that Harris is proposing? One which is, in which our bodies, again, are the condition of addressability. And in nature addresses us. It comes with ancestral continuities and entanglements that address us. And there's something that connects us. Our unconscious and nature's unconscious connect somehow, and Harris tries to tease out what that connection is. Here are the two covers for Wilson Harris's omnibuses. The first one collects his first 4 books in the Guyana Quartet, and the Carnival Trilogy collects his 15th, 16th, and 17th book, I believe. Here's some more wonderful covers, Black Marsden and Angel at the Gate. And another painting from the Stanley Greaves series. This one is Dialectic of Progress. So this one kind of addresses the blood myth of the Caribbean, the whole kind of like tripartite racial proposal, like, oh, we're 1/3 Indian, 1/3 African, 1/3 European. That might be true for some people, but in general it's used as a kind of political cudgel, and the distinctions between those different groups and the tensions and the deep-rooted anti-blackness of the Caribbean kind of gets elided through this blood myth, right? You also get a lot of white Latino people expressing themselves as people of color through this blood myth. So yeah, this is a great painting that tackles some of these issues. So what are some of the critical perspectives on Harris? Early work found parallels between the thought of Harris, Heidegger, and Hegel. So kind of focus on the dialectical nature of Harris's writing. And we see this in critique by C.L.R. James and Gregory Shaw. We have to understand that when Harris was first coming out as a writer, people were still kind of in a rationalist, modernist context. And so a lot of the analysis around Harris really was kind of European aspirational. Like, it was trying to put him in line with the European canon. But luckily, more recently, people like Paget Henry, who I've already mentioned, and Hannah Mace Jelinek, one of the foremost scholars on Harris, argued that to get to these depths, Harris needs neither Hegel or Heidegger. And that's from Paget Henry's book, An Introduction to Afro-Caribbean Philosophy from 2000. Rather, Harris's approach emerges from a dialogue with traditional African philosophy at the center of the Caribbean's poeticist tradition of thought, a tradition Henry locates in Harris, Aimé Césaire, Sylvia Wynter, Derek Walcott, Edouard Glissant, and more recently, I'd add, as heirs to this tradition and people that continue it, Emnu Basic Phillip, Jamaica Kincaid, Dion Brand, Audre Lorde, Erna Broadburr from Jamaica, lots more people. This tradition is, again, it's ancestrally embedded. It's something that's inherent to the Caribbean. Paget Henry, again, contrasts poeticism with historicism embodied by people like C.L.R. James, Frantz Fanon, Walter Rodney, Marcus Garvey. The most current critical work on Harris, though, proposes a synthesis of the above two. So the Western aspirational and the kind of Pan-African understanding of Harris that was the middle phase. So Michael Mitchell, for example, and Gianluca Delfino argue that Harris is in connection with different traditions, such as the Western canon, Africana thought, and Gnosticism/Hermeticism. Another constitutive element of his philosophy is pre-Columbian and Amerindian views of the world. So it took a long time for the critical tides to kind of just accept at face value the claims that Harris was making, that he is working in a cross-cultural capacity. There was a lot of essentialism going on in the first two phases that wasn't really useful for understanding his work. And so we came full circle essentially in the critical tides. Like, it took this long to just accept what he was saying, that he was working within all of these different traditions and finding the connections. So here's kind of a diagram of the critical tides. First is dialectic and being toward death, then Africana thought, the eternal struggle of ego and consciousness, and finally the cross-cultural synthesis. This is the modern perspective on Harris. Here are some covers of books about Harris. A couple more. The one on the left is really good. Again, one of these chapbooks produced at the University of Texas, Austin, while Harris worked there. And he's there on the bottom. C.L.R. James in the middle. Okay. Let's talk a bit more about cross-culturality. Humanity and landscape are linked in epochal reincarnating cycles of becoming. There are no absolutes or fixity of identity, rather there are only sedimented layers of this becoming hood. Against the concept of the multicultural, Harris instead argues for the cross-cultural. He says, our humanity is impoverished when we seize on either tradition or identity. I'm not interested in a multicultural community, but in a cross-cultural community, in ways in which a myth in one can find parallels in the other. I look to create a kind of community that has a literacy of the imagination in it, that can unlock polarizations and fanaticisms that bedevil us. Parts of ourselves are embedded everywhere, in the rock, in the tree, in the star, in the river, in the earth, everywhere. Here's an epigraph from one of Harris's books. What seems like a Catholic song, Catholic folk song, is actually, at least in the proposal of the rest of this book, is actually a tradition of indigenous people that links Puerto Rico and Mexico ancestrally. This is really interesting because one of the earliest groups that populated Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Dominican Republic and Haiti, one of the earliest groups that populated these places were from the Yucatan, right? So there is an ancestral connection between indigenous people of the Yucatan and indigenous people of the Caribbean and the descendants of both. So this fake folk song that was found among the fool's papers, as Harris's epigraph states, it kind of stands in for this ancestral connection. I can try to sing it. San Jose Maria, a Belén llegaron. Oh, that's awful. Let's just play it. It's pretty. So Harris is a predecessor. Harris presaged post-colonial, post-negritude movements of aesthetic and cultural hybridity. Some examples are Martinican thinker Edouard Glisson's Ontological, developed in the 60s and 70s. Glisson says, the preoccupation with the universal is the alienated reverse side of the uniquely Western pretension to exercise universal control. So universalism is a disciplinary tactic. It's colonial. And it therefore follows that proponents of Ontological must adopt a firm opposition to any ideology of universal culture. Rather than strategic essentialisms about Africa, Glisson argued that Antillean Afro-diasporic people were the other America, a nexus of Afroic, Amerindigenous, Asiatic local developments. And in the 80s, Martinican thinkers and writers Patrick Chamoiseau, Jean Bernabé, and Raphaël Confiant extended some of these thoughts in the movement called Créolité. And one of their most famous quotes is, "Créolité is an annihilation of false universality, monolingualism, and purity. Neither Europeans, nor Africans, nor Asians, we declare ourselves Creoles." So these are two kind of two sides of the same coin, but they're also quite distinct because for Glisson, the emphasis is on the mix, while in Créolité, the emphasis is on not the mix, but rather an entirely new thing that comes out of the mix, right? There's no necessary link to Europe or Africa or Asia that Caribbeans need to have to be Caribbean. It's just kind of built into the context. It doesn't have to be essentialized in any way. And we can't essentialize ourselves in that way. We can't say that, oh, we are European, oh, we are African, oh, we are Asian, oh, we are indigenous. Some people can say that, but the mixed population that mostly peoples the Caribbean today is not one that can essentialize itself in this way. I certainly can't do that. Here's Éloge de la Créolité. Horizons of Afro-indigeneity. The gist of these movements is that negritude's understanding of blackness in relation to the Antilles was too monolithic. It was a kind of racial romanticism or an inaccurate essentialism to cope with the real situation, right? Rather, the Caribbean person is a new kind of entity which did not exist before. Our home is both distant and near. It's the Caribbean itself, which inherently indexes Africa, the Orinoco Valley, where the Arawak people came from, the Yucatan, as I said. Indigenous Africans were enslaved and brought to this hemisphere, forged a new kind of indigeneity in their encounter with Amerindigenous people. And this concept is called Afro-indigeneity. As such, I see Antilleanité and Créolité in conversation with the Afro-Indigenous movement. Afro-Taino thinker D. Caban coined this term to describe the precisely post-classical or post-encounter type of native person that emerged in the Caribbean, the American South, and Afro-South America. The land stewardship, cultural legacies, and survivance of hybrid indigenous forms of life embodied by this type of person. That's what the term is used for, right? It's a way of saying that indigenous and black are not mutually exclusive, but always in conversation, and especially in the context of a place like the Caribbean, inextricable and mutually dependent for some people. For example, maroon communities, Los Cimarrones and the Quilombos in Brazil. So here are some thoughts from a non-black Taino person. In what ways are we rethinking, re-expanding categories, finding ways to embrace transatlantic African diaspora whose cultures formed here in the Caribbean? What if we affirm the indigeneity of black folks and that it did not end with the Middle Passage? What if we consider their histories with these lands valid? How do we take on the hard task of acknowledging that a narrow characterization or categorization of native leaves black folks in placelessness, #decolonial love? How do we take on the hard task of acknowledging that a narrow categorization of natives leaves black folks as other or foreign? How do we take on the hard task of acknowledging the narrow category of native constrains and frames anti-black thought in Indian communities? What if we considered more than black Indians as native, Afro-indigeneity as material and non-material, relations that stretch back to these lands, but also situated here in innovation, adaptation, those lands, as in Africa. This thinker, her name is Kayla Opego-Wirang. She's really cool. Dika Wang is a good friend of hers. They're two kind of central thinkers in the concept of Afro-indigeneity. Inasa Crockett is another thinker. So True on Twitter. She's a Southern American, black Southern American, like from the South. So Créolité and Afro-indigeneity are like two sides of a mirror in antagonism, though. The former emphasizes hybridity and constant flux of emergent indigenous Caribbean cultures, but the latter emphasizes continuity, retention, inclusion of those cultures within a broader African indigenous and Amerindigenous conversation. Harris operates in a parallel register to these, but he locates deep ancestry, including pre-human ancestry, and the living nature of the landscape in a way that would not necessarily, for example, celebrate New World hybridity the way that Qualité does, or celebrate inclusion the way that Afro-indigeneity does. The central value of each has already been present in the structure of humanity, for example, in the pre-Columbian mercantile African contact that Van Sertima argued for, or the co-occurrence or co-identity, for example, of Yoruba Oricha Eshu Elegbara, the giver of Ifa, and Fon Vodun Legba, both divine tricksters and guardians of the doorway, linguists for the supreme deities of their respective pantheons. So this is an argument that syncretism itself, as Harris would say, is ancestrally embedded. Syncretism did not start in the New World. That's a very America-centric perspective. Syncretism is ancestral, and it goes back to Africa. It goes back to the Amerindigenous mainland. It goes back to Asia, or all the other different sources of Caribbean people in the current context. So the following Yoruba example is a good one that I kind of want to focus on for a quick second. So bear with me. This is interesting, but oversimplified for the purposes of time. The oral history of the Fon attributes their origins to a group from Tado in southeast Togo who settled in the Aja kingdom of Ardra, now Ayala, Benin. In the 12th century, a great disagreement caused a split, and in 1600, one group, led by Doaklin, went north and founded Abomey, the capital of the kingdom of Dahomey, circa 1600 to 1894. These people intermarried with the Oyo, i.e. the Yoruba inhabitants there, and the children of these marriages became known as the Fon. Did the Yoruba originate and spread Legba to the Fon, or vice versa? Same question applies to Fongu and Yoruba Ogun, both gods of iron and war, as well as Nanabuluku, who occurs in both, the sky mother, the ancient mother of the sky. So cross-culturality is not New World in origin, but a condition of possibility for cultural development, period, wherever we find ourselves. Harris might also co-locate the originary importance of the panther, P. pardis, for the Fon, who say they descend from an Aja princess who mated with the panther, with the importance of the jaguar, or P. Anka, in Olmec and Maya cultures. And here a kind of Harrisian portal would open up. So here's the journey from Tado to Ardra, or modern-day Ayada, and then north to Abomey. Doaklin had two other brothers that went elsewhere, and they founded their own kingdoms. So the argument between them caused a great split. Here is Cyprien Tokodaba's depiction of the Fon Vodun Agasu. And so here we have on the left the Yoruba and Orisha Eshu Elegbara, and on the right the Fon Vodun Legba. We see that both of them have horns, right? On the left, musical horns, as well as kind of horn-shaped head cap. And the cowrie shells kind of look similar to the chest markings on the right for me. On the right, the horns obviously on the head, and the phallic representation. So yeah, we can see that these are very different, but at the same time, there's an overlap there. There's a syncretism that's ancestral that comes, that's a condition of possibility for what happened in the New World, the religious and cultural syncretism that occurred. Here's a page in longhand from the original manuscript of Wilson Harris's novel Resurrection at Sorrow Hill from 1993. Okay, so where's a good place to start with Wilson Harris? The book from which the poem I quoted in the epigraph comes is a good place to start, Eternity to Season. It's easy to read, it encompasses a lot of his philosophy, and it doesn't have some of the difficult stylistic tendencies of his novels. Palace of the Peacock, his first book, is a great introduction to the mythopoetic approach of Harris. And it's reasonably written, like it's still fairly realist in some of its language. I think he was still finding his way, so it strikes a good balance. Sleepers of Roraima from 69 and The Age of Rainmakers from 71 are short stories based on Guyanese indigenous myth with illustrations by Kay Usborne. They're short, I mean they're dense and so deeply embedded in the mythical context that they're sourcing from, but their length makes them easier to read. It's just a quick read, and it's a good kind of like brisk exposure to some of the complexities of Harris's work. Good budget buys would be the omnibuses, which I mentioned before. The Guyana Quartet collects his first 4 novels, and the Carnival Trilogy collects his 15th, 16th, and 17th. Best secondary sources, we saw some of them before: Henry Mace Jelinek, C.L.R. James, Nathaniel Mackey, Gianluca Delfino, Joyce Adler, Homi Bhabha, and Paget Henry, of course. Here's Harris with his second wife, Margaret. Margaret Burns was a Scottish poet, white Scottish woman. Here's Harris's oeuvre. First poetry, then the novels, and the nonfiction. So obviously we can see that he's got a long, productive career. Here's the cover of Jonestown, one of my favorite Harris books. Okay, what are some potential critiques of Harris? Well, obviously he's hard to read, and that's just fair enough. If you can't, if you don't enjoy the way that he writes, you just can't. You don't have to, you know. If you can't deal with it, you don't have to. Harris can be critiqued for not writing women characters with much depth. And in reality, none of his characters feel very full or whole. They feel like archetypal ciphers, and that the main character is always the form of the book and the landscape itself. So this is another potential critique. It's not character driven, and that's part of why it's hard to read. The characters are super archetypal and flat. With that being said, it is the case that his most fully formed characters are always men. His protagonists tend to be men. So there's a feminist critique of Harris that needs to happen. For a writer so enthralled to the mythopoetics of everyday West Indian life and the monumental philosophical and aesthetic developments that emerge from that everyday, you'd expect that Harris might write some strong or deep characters, right? But ultimately the land, and again the form of the novel, ultimately tends to be the strongest character. And this is some tea. I mean, I don't know what the context here is, but he did leave his children with Cecily Carew from his first marriage. By the 50s, after that marriage fell apart, Harris moved to the UK. I just hope that he helped them from overseas with literary income. I just haven't confirmed it. And you know, this is just tea. So take it with a grain of salt. But we do want to shout out his kids. Let's do that. Denise Harris won the 1996 Guyana Prize in Literature for her debut novel Web of Secrets. Ian Nigel Harris is currently the Chancellor of the University of Guyana and the former Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. Alexis and Michael Harris, I couldn't find much about them online, but shouts out to them as well. And I couldn't find a photo of Cecily Carew, but here are photos of her siblings, Jan Carew, the novelist, and Joy Carew, the professor in Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville. So shouts out Cecily, shouts out the family. Here's a diagram from Fossil and Psyche, produced at the University of Austin, Texas. One of Harris's characteristically complex diagrams. Cool, thank you all so much. I'll be around for questions.